The mega trend was that organizations globally were becoming tech. So increasingly, every business had to hire technology talent. And we kind of realized that this problem is only going to become harder and harder as this thing scales out. So I think that was, the motivation as to how we kind of started.
Welcome to Prime Venture Partners Podcast, a podcast for entrepreneurs looking to build and grow their startups. Learn about uncommon strategies and common traps from makers and doers of startup ecosystem.
Welcome, Sachin, to Prime Podcast. It's great to have you in the middle of this pandemic, so appreciate taking the time.
Thanks, Shripati. My pleasure. Absolutely delighted to be on the podcast today.
So I see that you have a haircut, which is, is it a do-it-yourself kind of haircut here?
Yeah, I think you can see it's visibly, do it yourself. Actually, not myself. My wife did it for me. And I trust her with my hair. I've done it twice already in the lockdown.
I think this is a new style of haircut. You should call it the pandemic style.
Pandemic cut. Yeah.
Although I think she might be getting better over time. So Sachin is a co-founder and CEO of HackerEarth. Tell us a little bit about your journey. Like, what was the inspiration behind HackerEarth? How did it get started?
We started in early 2012, but the idea for HackerEarth was seeded even before that. And, I was obviously in school, university at that time. And the idea came very organically. We were not looking to start up per se. Frankly, we were kids in third year and everything is like, those starry-eyed kids in an IIT and the world is your oyster, right? So not really committed to anything at that point of time, but we're just experimenting. Before that, we had done tons of things around research and a bunch of other things. And of course, TechCrunch and those articles and overnight success stories kind of wooed us into doing something. So while we were thinking, hey, let's do something interesting, an incident kind of happened. One of my very close friends who was top of his batch, and we kind of really respected him for what he brought, like what he has, his skills, didn't quite get through the top companies during a placement season. When I say top company, I'm talking about the Googles, Facebooks of the world. And if you're not familiar with IIT placement time, it's full of excitement and stress. And there's almost like finale of a tournament, right? You've got day 0 and day 1 and day 2, and everybody's betting who's going to come back with an offer in hand on day 0, day 1. So he was that kind of guy who had, everybody was saying he's going to get placed on day 0. He didn't get through till day 6 or 7. And that was a big shock to us because that was the kind of talent companies would kill for. And I think that was a motivation for us. We thought, hey, there's a problem at hand here because we being developers ourselves knew that assessing the skill sets of a developer is not that hard. I mean, it's objective. Yes, it may be a hard problem, but it is still fairly objective, right? You can devise ways by which you don't make wrong decisions. So we did a quick dip check, spoke to some of our seniors and tried to figure out, do they feel that there's a problem at the other end, which is, the people who are trying to hire. And it resonated with everybody. Like everybody, even till days, says recruiting is hard, tech recruiting is harder. And I think that was the impetus for us to kind of create a platform that makes the whole process of hiring, tech hiring, democratic and skill driven. We very strongly believe that, talent is universally distributed and opportunities are not. But if we can create a system, a platform that allows a kid sitting in some remote part of the world, but, having access to a computer and internet, has the potential to develop those skills and give the Ivy League school kids a run for the money. And that belief, the problem that we kind of experienced firsthand, led us to kind of start HackerEarth. And then as we, just adding on to it, as we kind of progress through the journey, we realized that there was a massive trend that was taking shape at that point of time. This is 2012. Anderson at that time had just quoted Mark Anderson that software is eating the world. And the mega trend was that organizations globally were becoming tech. So increasingly, every business had to hire technology talent. And we kind of realized that this problem is only going to become harder and harder as this thing scales out. So I think that was, the motivation as to how we kind of started.
Problem that you felt yourself firsthand, and then you figured, okay, let's actually go about trying to solve it. And in one sense, removing the qualitative aspects from tech hiring, right, and making it more quantitative and objective was the original inspiration. So can you take us from then to where HackerEarth is now? So some of the key both decisions you have made to get to the point where you are today?
So, obviously it's 7 years now, so a lot of history, a lot of things. So I'll try to compress and like pick out the key ones. I think the very first key decision that worked out very well for us was we, from day one, decided it that we wanted to build a business which was not just an enterprise SaaS application, but also there had to be a community element. So if you look at recruiting, there are obviously two parties involved, right? So one is the employer and the other is the person who's looking for employment. And we wanted to keep the developer centric to our product, our company, our mission and vision. So we invested very, very early into community. And when I say community, basically we wanted to have a version of the product that was available to developers all across the globe, free of use, so that we could get developers onto our platform. Obviously, the promise still continues to be that if we have enough developers on the platform whose skill sets we are aware of, we can leverage that to monetize in various other ways. But I wouldn't say that was the only reason why we invested. We just felt that our business needed to have a community element. And that has reaped us a lot of benefits over the years. One is obviously, like I said, the opportunity that it opens up for you in future in terms of additional business models. The other is the one that we did not know about at that point of time consciously is it helps you build a very strong brand. So the developers who used our product in 2012, 2013 are today senior engineers in a lot of organizations. They may not be the buyers, they may not be the economic buyers for our product, but they are definitely influencers. And that brand goes from, it has gone to 4 million developers today. And that in some way has helped us to build that business. So that's one value that we didn't know at that point of time. And I would recommend everyone to invest in some sort of community. Every business can create some kind of community. The large or small is independent of that because it has compounding effects. So just like, SaaS recurring revenue has compounding effects, community also has compounding effects. So that's, the first kind of key decision that we took. The second, I would say is kind of recent. So I'm kind of fast forwarding many years, and this is 2019 or actually 18 when I finally committed to move to the US. And then moved in 2019, early 2019. And why I would say that is a key decision is because our perspective has changed since then. In the early 4 years of the company, we did not feel that assessments is a deep enough market because a lot of our business was coming from India. And while we were getting good customer growth, so we were acquiring a lot of customers, there were two problems. The depth within each account was low. Indian customers at the end of the day have much lesser paying capacities than US counterparts. The same organization, which has an MNC, like a back office in India, would pay you probably 1/10 of what their US counterparts would. And the second is the need for software, or the value of software is much, much underappreciated in India, and that's why they haggle on price, right? So the organizations are not deep in itself, and they don't want to pay you a lot. But in the US, it's a completely different thing. Market is massive. Like it is easily 5 to 10 times in terms of both the depth of the market itself, meaning the number of customers, plus the paying capacities. So I think that was a seminal decision for us to say that, okay, we're going to go to the US and commit to that. And that changed our perspective. So while in the early years of the company, we felt that assessments could not be a big business, today we are very committed and very strongly believe that assessments alone itself can help us to build a meaningful business. And I think that was the other, that's the other thing. I can talk about, some of the other things that kind of we did in between. One of them was as we were building out the developer community, we, being in India, right, there's a jugaad, right? So you try and figure out value. You try and extract value for everything that you have right from day one. And as we were building out this community, we did not have a monetization model in place, but we were always open to ideas. So we did a lot of experimentation, business model experimentation, user acquisition experimentation, and some of those experiments worked very well for us from a community perspective. If I look back, there are I think about 7 or 8 different sub products that we built, launched, and killed when it comes to community. And I think 3 or 4 of them still survive, but those have given us organic user growth, 4 million developers till date. And we wouldn't have spent any marketing. I'm like some marketing capitals, but compared to a lot of other businesses, very, very little marketing capital. That's because we grew organically, right? And a lot of it is owed to those experiments that we did. Things like experimenting with university networks. How do we tap into colleges? How do we leverage SEO content? How do we get more people to get their friends to join and be part of the community? So I think some of those things that we did helped us grow. And now coming back to that point of Jugaad, so we tried to monetize as we were building out the community, we tried to monetize it at various instances, and through all these experimentations we landed on hackathons. So a part of our business is hackathons, and if I look back in time, it's both good and bad. Good because it gave us immediate way to monetize and grow the community. So hackathons is where your customers are paying you to do a hackathon in your community, and their brand gets you more users, right? So in some sense, your customers are subsidizing your user acquisition cost. What it did result in is that we started on the path of having two business models. So one was a SaaS assessment solution that we have, and the second was hackathons, which was more like a managed service. And that has both its positives and negatives over the years. So I think these are two or three key decision points for us over the years.
So I will get back to that US decision in greater detail later in the podcast. So community creation, one key decision, actually driving a monetization engine on top of community, another major decision, as well as moving to the US. So let me roll back a little bit, and we learn and say that we learn more from our mistakes than our successes, right? Right. And you mentioned a few of the dead ends and mistakes which you might have gone and learned from. So if I were to ask you to reflect over the journey of the last 6-8 years of HackerEarth, what were some of the dead ends or mistakes which actually ring true in your mind, which you'd like to talk about, which you thought really helped in forming your future decisions?
So I think one of the mistakes and all of this is like in hindsight, right? As a founder, it's very, very hard to kind of do this in real time, and what worked for us may not work for others and vice versa, right? So take everything with a pinch of salt. But one thing that I think we should have done sooner is, this move to the US. And that's really about I'm not advocating every SaaS business to move to the US. I think it's committing to your market. You have to pick a market day one. I would say day -1, right? When you've not even written a single line of code, you need to have absolute clarity in terms of what market I'm going to try first. I'm not saying stick to that market forever, but you got to commit to one market in the beginning. If it's India, do your analysis. Has to be deep enough, right? If you're building a venture-backed business, it should be big, and it also matches up. You have to see what matches up to your aspirations. But if not, then look at other markets. Mistake that we did, we had our feet in two boats. India worked for us in the beginning. We kind of grew organically, even on the sales side. I hired my first sales guy in June of 2014. And I think in less than a year, I had about 8-10 sales guys. And I didn't have a marketing engine to feed leads to them, but they were just, doing business on their own. So India sales led business grew very fast. But we were also trying to do US, and we were trying to do US through an inside sales model. And we were trying to replicate what worked for us in India. And for the first 2 years, it just didn't work, right? So that's one thing I've learned, that if we wanted to do US, I would have even gone to the extent of saying I wouldn't have done India for the first 2 years and just put all my energy on the US. And if it didn't work, then it didn't work. So I think that's one mistake in hindsight. The second would be, as a founder, you're always balancing capital versus control. And particularly as a first-time founder, you're very sensitive to control because you don't know who you're getting on the board. You're also not that savvy in terms of managing a board. But my advice, is that there is an amount of capital that gives you the freedom to be bold and do experiments, right? And because there is no recipe to success for any startup, right? There's no textbook that you could follow and be successful. Every company that I have spoken with, founders I've spoken with, they've all scripted their own journeys in their own unique ways, which means you need to have enough serendipity, around you, or enough chance. You have to do enough experiments. You never know who you meet, where you meet them. That results in a conversation, that results in a sale being closed, that results in you launching a new product feature, making it generally available, and then business shooting up. You cannot engineer those things, right? So capital gives you that room to do experiments. That's the other thing that I would advise founders, that raise enough capital, but then also don't raise it for the sake of raising. Have a plan of action as to how you're going to use it, right? And do experimentations on all fronts, mostly on the distribution side. How can I use my capital to do experimentation on the marketing and sales side? I wouldn't recommend doing experimentation on the product side if you do not have a way to get market feedback. Right. So always my take is apply your capital to do experiments on the marketing and sales side. So you acquire more customers and they will tell you what's the right product for you to build out, not for hiring 15 engineers and there are 3 pods of 5 engineers each one of them building out their own product. It doesn't work that way, in my opinion. The third thing that I would say is for a SaaS business, I very strongly feel that marketing as a skill, an organizational skill, precedes sales as a skill. And that we didn't know, obviously. And we invested in sales more because India is a very sales driven market. But almost all the rest of the world is very marketing driven. And there are a lot of nuances which I could dive into, but in the interest of time, I'll pause here. So, like I said, those are 3 things that I could think of the last 7 years.
Fascinating. So you said, commit to your market. It might not be your final market, but you should get going in one market with both feet on that market and aligning all your arrows towards that. Second thing you said is trade-off between capital and control. How much to raise when? It's not that bootstrapping is always the right thing. It's not like raising a lot of money is always the right thing. But raising adequate capital or having access to adequate capital is definitely the right thing. And using that capital for experimentation to actually get validation of your business model, maybe validation of the value proposition, etc. And finally, we talked about building the marketing skills versus sales skills. It's much easier when you're especially focusing on the Indian market where if I may add, the sales costs are lower. Yep. Yeah, the cost of actually building a sales force is actually significantly lower. Whereas marketing is sort of a flywheel which spins slowly, but down the road, it has got heft, right? It is spinning on its own. So that's fascinating. So now let's talk about, SaaS out of India. And so that is, we have a number of SaaS companies. And if you were to build a company today and I'm a founder who has got a SaaS product, and let's say that the market is the US. Let's for the moment say that to simplify our discussion. What advice would you have for them as they go about doing it? That's one. And a related question is that after you moved a couple of years back to the US, what has been your experience as a founder which they need to be aware of? So both from a company standpoint and a personal standpoint, what would be your thoughts?
So maybe I'll end up blending up the answers to both of them, but let me, I'll come to the latter one towards the second half of my answer. As a company, I think you can absolutely build out a SaaS business from anywhere in the world. From a belief faith perspective, I think it's absolutely possible, given that every distribution is so digital today. However, the first thing that you need to know as a founder is you need to intimately understand your customer and your market, which means you need to understand how US buyers buy, what kind of content they want to read when they make a buying decision, what is their sales process, what is the emotional aspect involved in that sale. Every sale has something. To us, it looks like a transaction, but whenever a user commits to pay you, there is an emotional element in the back of their minds. If you're a developer tool, all the developer is thinking about, how do I make my life easier? How do I build scalable system, right? A lot of other functions, particularly in the US, and this is an insight that I kind of garnered over the last 6 months to a year, everybody wants to show to their bosses that they took a right decision. And that decision in terms of a software purchase has resulted in business efficiencies. That's their motivation, right? How do you play into that? So it's important. India has its own set of challenges, but US, so you got to understand your customer intimately, which means as a founder, you should have spent some time in this market, or you've experienced that by working in an organization that sells to the US. Like there are various ways by which you can get exposed to that, but you should definitely develop that understanding. The second is, and again, my perspective, that building a SaaS business that focuses on SMB, and SMB, I would say deal sizes that go up to a maximum of $10,000 to $15,000. And that's too on the higher side. A good range would be anything between $1,000 to $3,000. I'm talking about ARR. Is 1 to 5 is absolutely possible from India to the US, in the US, provided your primary acquisition source is through a touchless or very low touch sales process. So if you're in the space where your buyer comes online, researches, tries out a couple of products. You're not really talking to procurement. There are not extensive sales cycles involved, and they swipe the credit card and they move on. It works. Hence, which means if you're in a market which is kind of well understood, right? You obviously, I'm not saying, you do your product innovation, but if the product or the market is kind of well understood, they're comparing you with another product, and if you understand what are the motivations they're switching, then obviously you'll bake that into your marketing message. It becomes easier because you can leverage SEO, you can leverage search engine marketing, you can leverage a lot of marketing tools. But as soon as you start going mid market, which is, I would say, $15,000 to $20,000 deals to enterprise, and I'm talking mostly about land opportunities here, you would land a 15 to 30 40k for mid market to enterprise, and expand potential goes up to even a million and a half in the enterprise segment. You need to be here. Even in the first category, I would say, as a founder, you should spend enough time here, but majority of your business or your team could be in India. But for an enterprise segment, you need to have sales here, because there is a sales process, there's a sales methodology that is followed here where customers are used to buying that way. And you would never know. As an Indian, you would not know the cultural nuances. How do you walk those corridors? How do you do a small talk? Like, coming to your second question, my personal experience, the way you build a relationship with a person is very different the way you would do it here. Here, people expect those first 3 minutes of small talk, right? It's part of their culture. And if you cannot do that small talk, then you stand out as someone who's different, right? No bias. I wouldn't say that, we face bias per se, but you're different. And on another hand, they have another vendor who's like them, right? There's an unconscious bias that creeps in the selling process. You're just different to them. So you've got to learn that. And, I've learned to do that myself over the last year or so, and I'm still developing that. The second would be, how do you, in a sales process, it's very, very important to talk to the economic buyer. And any sales process which has RFPs and RFIs, the gatekeepers do not typically let you pass through to the economic buyer. Now, how do you work your way up? You got to understand the culture here. Your connects help. A local VC helps. Hiring a sales guy who's been in the industry for many years, they come with their own Rolodex. They will not get you the deals, but they'll help you work the people here, right? So I think those are things that one needs to keep in mind. Having said that, I would kind of end that first part of the question by saying, I think it's a great combination to have a presence in India and trying to sell here in the US. You just need to understand what components need to lie where. Tech can absolutely be out of India. We've got the same quality, similar quality engineers, I would say, in India. They just need the right guidance. And we have successfully shown multiple times that we can build a product that can be sold to the world. So your product can sit out of here. Your operations can sit out of here. Your customers are also okay with support being out of, other part of the world. I think what US brings onto the table is your marketing and sales skills. And believe me when I say it, we Indians are not instinctively great at selling. But it's ingrained here in the culture. Kids are taught from the school itself how to be outspoken, how to sell, right? And that's how you see that the sales and marketing talent is the best here. So that's from the company perspective. Again, it boils down to what kind of business you're trying to build. I don't think today there's a dearth of capital in India. Earlier, the competitive advantage to being in the US was that you could raise money, large money, but we've all been proven wrong in the last 2-3 years with respect to that. But like I said, if you're building out a very enterprises business, then as a founder, you need to be working these circles here, because a local VC here. So let's say you had to, you raise 10 million, but your primary audience customer base is here in the US. I would any day recommend a US VC. At least the brand name should be US, because then your customers feel that, okay, you've bought, you're backed by by a local investor. You could, work those connections and get introductions. If you just have an Indian VC who doesn't have connections here, you're not extracting the most out of your capital. So I think you, as a founder, you end up building that kind of network if you are here. So I think those are the few things that I've personally learned, and as for the organization as well.
Very useful. So what you're saying is, see where your market is. If it's an SMB less than, say, $5,000 to $10,000 a year contract, then it can be mostly touchless, maybe some inside sales entirely out of India, understand what your customer wants, drive SEO and SEM, and you'll be able to build a reasonable sized business. But if you're looking at mid-market or enterprise, that requires the understanding of both the deep understanding of the sales process of the customer, needs physical presence here, And it's not just about the hard aspect, but also the soft aspects of connecting with your customer. And
Right.
second point being that you need to understand who the economic buyer is. It's not just the technical decision maker, how the economic process flows. And in order to do all of those, having investors who have deep connects in the US ecosystem is important, because that's how you're leveraging your investors to have the company go forward. So
Right.
Let me switch tacks here, Sachin. And one of the things which I have seen you do, and I have really admired, is the way you communicate with your team. I know that you send monthly updates to your team, and you're very transparent with your team about what's going on, both the successes and the challenges in the company and so forth. So talk a little bit about what your philosophy of team building is, and how have you managed to do that, continue that now that you have moved to the US?
So I've got one word for that. It's absolutely critical to be authentic. You are who you are. And I'm also talking about being very vulnerable, but you've got to let your team know exactly who you are, what drives you, what are your passions, what are you afraid of. And I'm not saying, do an all hands where you talk about yourself. But in your conversations, you've got to appear as authentic. And I like being transparent, right? Because then I'm not thinking when I'm getting into a conversation, hey, did I tell this thing to this guy, right? I like being transparent because if there is a challenge that we're facing as an organization, and you'll always face tons of challenges, and you really need people who, as a founder, and I'm not talking about your board and maybe your mentors, but from your team itself, who'll say, hey, Sachin, don't worry, we're going to make it happen. And I can't tell you how many instances I've had over the years where my team has been more aggressive with me, because they know I'm being very authentic and genuine. When I have a challenge, I'm genuinely seeking help from them. So I think that's one thing that I've realized, being authentic is important. And in line with that is being transparent, because people want to know what is controlling their destinies, right? At least in the early days, people who join you, they're putting a lot on the stake, right? And if they do not know why certain decisions are being taken, and those decisions change their life, right? You spend a third of your life at work, and it impacts you in various ways, economic, personally, socially, otherwise. If they do not know what those decisions, how are those being controlled, then they would never truly embrace you as an organization. So for me, that transparency really helped, because I could connect people to the company. Apart from that, I think communication, I cannot stress on how much you need to communicate as a founder. The biggest thing that I miss being here in the US is my all hands. We used to have an all hands starting 30. We in the beginning we had it like every 2 weeks, but then we kind of did it every 45 days, and it would go anything between 90 minutes to 3 hours, and people would be wrapped in attention listening to it all the time, because that was the time when we could share in company information, we could share our challenges, our wins, we could talk about what lies ahead, because people want to know. The thing is, they don't ask. People are not great at asking, hey, what's our vision? What's our mission? What are we going to do 5 years down the line, 2, 3 years? But they want to know. Everybody wants to know. So you as a founder need to constantly, as a CEO, constantly need to have your grounds to the ear, understand what people want to want to know, and then kind of relay that information. So being transparent and over communication is I would say both written and verbal. I think the former is easier to develop than the latter. Some people naturally have a flair to be, they speak well, but written communication can be developed, right? So I strongly recommend everyone to send out, as a CEO, send out monthly updates to their teams and talk to them. It's not a list of 5 things that you want to you cover. It's not a task list for you. It should be an open conversation. This is what we're trying to do. This is what we're thinking. This is the challenges we saw, all of those things, right? So transparency and over communication is kind of work for us. To your second part of the question, how I've been doing it since I moved to the US. It's hard in the sense that, we are across a 12-hour time zone difference. So I've got my mornings and evenings packed. So that was one of the things that I wanted to talk about, when you asked me about moving to the US. You've got to commit to weird working hours. I never slept in the afternoon while I was in India, but that's the only time now when I can catch an hour-long sleep, because that's the time I'm most free, because both evenings and mornings are packed. So you've got to commit to that. And it's hard. It is both emotionally and physically taxing, right? Because suddenly your cycle has flipped. A new founder here in the US, you don't have that social circle. You used to be, the celebrity, for a lack of a better word, back home, because, you've got 100% company, people around you, that social interaction that we naturally crave for is all missing. It's all remote, all digital. And by the way, world is moving towards remote work, but I'm not a great fan of remote work, because You don't get to feel the emotions over video. So I think it's very, very important to have two things: cadence and communication. So mandatory check-ins, things that would get discussed casually in a water cooler chat when you are in there locally, don't happen here, right? Because there's a 12-hour difference and you don't do that naturally on a chat. So you need to have weekly check-ins. I have a weekly meeting with every leader that I have in the company. The second thing is these conversations need to be structured. You've got to take out, believe me, you've got to take out time for small talk. You cannot just jump into business and metrics, because people are used to spending time with you casually, telling you about themselves, asking about you. But now on video, that doesn't happen. So now I structure the first 5 minutes of my call to just talk about how things are with both the sides. So you've got to structure and make sure you cover everything. Otherwise, you'll just be grappling for time. So cadence and communication is one thing. The second thing is trust is very important. You've got to be absolutely be able to trust your team. And that was a big thing that I made sure I had in place before I moved to the US. One of the reasons I kind of delayed that decision was until I was absolutely sure that the team is what it needs to be, leadership team. I didn't want to move, because as soon as you leave as a CEO, there's a void. And we do have a void in that organization today. But if your leadership team is somebody you can trust, they can fill in that void. So make sure the team is in place and you have constant communication with them.
So authenticity, regular communication, and then having a team which can actually handle things in sort of required as you move to the US. So before we wrap up, I know that you have a new podcast which you have launched. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so its name is Breaking 404, and this podcast is for all engineers by engineering leaders. And our intent is to bring knowledge, the so-called tribal knowledge about how various engineering leaders have managed to build, ship, and scale some of the best tech solutions out there. So that's what the podcast is all about. We interview engineering leaders from different organizations. We've done it with engineering manager from Netflix and a bunch of other organizations. So it's for all the engineering guys out there.
I love the name of the podcast. And with probably one of the largest developer communities in the world at 4 million, I'm sure that it'll have a very, very interested audience. So thank you for spending time with us, Sachin, and all the best.
Thanks, Shripati. Thanks for having me.
Dear listeners, thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast app for free, and you'll be the first one to know when new episodes are available. Just search for Prime Venture Partners Podcast in Apple Podcast, Spotify, Castbox, or however you get your podcasts. Then hit subscribe. And if you have enjoyed the show, we would be really grateful if you leave us a review on Apple Podcast. To read the full transcript, find the link in the show notes.